Uvalde, 77 minutes. Police response, command indecision. I'm Mike Blangiforti, and this is Truth, Investigations, and Criminal Behavior. This episode discusses a shooting involving children. There are no graphic descriptions. The focus is operational, analytical, and centered on command decision-making and accountability. On May 24th, 2022, in Uvalde, Texas, at the Robb Elementary School, a shooter enters the school and proceeds to the wing of the school where fourth grade classes were in session. Then shots rang out. Officers respond quickly, within minutes, actually. And then the timeline stretches into what can only be described as a command failure. 77 minutes between first arrival and the moment that the shooter is neutralized. Now, this episode is not built for outrage, although you may very well be justifiably outraged. It's built for understanding, which I hope to provide to you from a professional, experience-based platform. Because if you want to prevent the repeat of something like Uvalde, you don't start by asking who felt what and when. You start by asking, what did the system do? What did it fail to do? Who was in command? Why were the decisions made critically wrong? Why weren't they challenged? And why did time passing become the most lethal variable on the scene? I'm going to walk you through what happened, what multiple investigations concluded, and why Uvalde became a case study in how multi-agency response collapses when command is not clear. Here's the timeline in operational terms, not rumor, not social media, not vibes, sequence, decisions, and consequences. Now, publicly documented accounts, especially the Texas House Committee report and the DOJ Critical Incident Review, describe a chain of events that began shortly after 11:28 a.m. and ends around 12:50 p.m. when the shooter is killed. Here's the timeline. 11:28 to 11:33. The shooter arrives at Robb Elementary and gets into the school. Law enforcement responds quickly, and the officers are on the scene within minutes. Now, early on, officers encounter gunfire, and the shooter retreats into connected classrooms, rooms that would become the focal point of the entire incident. Then there's the long middle, the 77 minutes that we're going to talk about in this episode. As more officers arrive from multiple agencies, a perimeter forms, sources accumulate, and the response behavior shifts from immediate engagement into a posture that's more consistent with a barricaded suspect, despite information that should have kept the incident classified as an active shooter. Now, at 12:50 p.m., the tactical team breaches and the shooter is killed. The overall delay is commonly referenced as 77 minutes, and it becomes the defining feature of this case. Now, that's the timeline. But the story isn't just, well, they waited. The story is why there was specific training designed for exactly this type of scenario that failed to be implemented. Let me put on my law enforcement hat for a moment, because this is where people sometimes get it wrong. So when I had a consulting business after I retired from the NYPD, I used to give active shooter presentations to schools, school district, and businesses. The sad part is that in between many of these presentations, I would unfortunately have to update the slide to show what would be the latest shooting. Active shooter doctrine, procedures for active shooter, post-Columbine especially, is reinforced by decades of training. It's not subtle. It prioritizes speed, engagement, and disruption. So let's talk briefly about what are you supposed to do in an active shooter situation. So Department of Homeland Security has it's designed for civilians facing an active shooter situation, which is run, hide, fight. That's that's the three things that you need to remember. Run. If there's a safe escape route available, evacuate immediately. Remember to have an escape plan. Leave belongings behind and help others if it's possible. Once safe, you call 911 immediately. Hide. If you can't evacuate, find a hiding place where the shooter's unlikely to find you. Secure your location by locking or barricading doors. Silence your phone and remain quiet and out of sight. The one that you don't want to get to, but we have to include, is fight. Listen, it's your last resort. When your life is in imminent danger, act as aggressively as possible using improvised weapons and committing to your actions to try and disarm, disable the shooter. Now, what do you do when law enforcement arrives? Now, responding law enforcement's priority is to stop the shooter, and they will not stop to help the injured until that scene is secure. They move toward the threat, stop the killing, and then stabilize. But you should remain calm and follow instructions. Keep your hands visible. Drop any items that you're carrying. Avoid sudden movements, pointing, yelling, all not good. Don't stop officers for help. Just proceed in the direction that they are entering from. Provide information if possible, such as the shooter's location and description. Okay, back to Uvalde. Both the Texas House investigation and the Department of Justice Critical Incident Review describe a response where that urgency did not hold and where leadership and coordination broke down. And here's a key point that many civilians miss. In a rapidly evolving incident, assuming command is a paramount function in law enforcement response to an active shooter. Now, most departments have clear designations for who is in command and when, from initial response to elevating ranks of responding units. In other words, there's always someone in charge and trained, as are all the responding police officers. If you don't have a clear incident commander, clearly identified, clearly communicating, clearly directing, what you get is not a coordinated response. You get dozens of armed law enforcement personnel, each operating in a way that they are waiting for someone in command to declare what the next move is. Now, when you strip this down to command decisions, the critical failures fall into a few categories, each documented in investigations. Now, one of the most damaging dynamics in Uvalde was the apparent shift into a position that treated the shooter like a barricaded suspect rather than an active shooter. Even though the information coming in should have demanded urgent action and classification as an active shooter. It was obvious. In plain language, when you misclassify something like this, every action becomes much slower. With a barricaded suspect, the tactic is isolate, contain, negotiate. With an active shooter, there is no waiting. The tactic is locate and neutralize and mitigate any civilian casualties. Ideally, there should be none. Now, there was no time in Uvalde for negotiating. Officers were waiting on keys, waiting on shields, waiting on a team, while valuable time just continued to tick away. As officers from multiple agencies converged on the scene, the most important question remained unanswered. Who was in command? And we know that uncertainty wasn't theoretical. It was spoken out loud on body-worn camera audio released as part of the investigative timeline. Officers can be heard debating authority in real time. One exchange captures the moment perfectly. An officer says, "If there's kids in there, we need to go in there." Another voice responds, Whoever is in charge will determine that. That exchange is not background noise. What it is the sound of command failure. At that point in the response, Uvalde Police Chief Pete Arredondo was the highest ranking on the scene. He was the official from the school district police department. What matters here isn't his title. It's his decision making. And we know what some of those decisions sounded like because they were recorded. In body camera recordings reviewed by investigators, Chief Arredondo can be heard giving explicit direction to subordinate officers. At one point, he says, "Tell them to fucking wait. No one comes in." That is not hesitation. That's a command. From an operational standpoint, that statement matters because it establishes three things simultaneously. A decision was made to delay entry. That decision was communicated to all law enforcement on the scene and responding to the scene. It subsequently overrode the instinct of other officers who wanted to move forward and breach. So when we analyze Arredondo's instruction to wait, we are not analyzing it just on its own. We're weighing it against active shooter doctrine, all of the available information on the scene at the time, and ongoing victim survivability. Now, it's important to understand why Arredondo believed waiting was the correct decision, because his own words explain his mindset. Later in that same sequence of recordings, he can be heard saying, "People are going to ask why we're taking so long. We're trying to preserve the rest of the life." Now, this statement is critical because at the very moment this statement was being made, children inside the classroom were still calling 911. That contradiction between belief and reality is at the heart of this case. He was focusing on public perception at a time where every second counted on the critical situation that was unfolding. Investigative timelines indicate that Arredondo attempted to speak to the shooter through the classroom wall, first in English, then in Spanish. There is no evidence of any response from the shooter. There was no dialogue. There was no structured back and forth. From a tactical standpoint, this does not meet the definition of negotiation. It was an attempt at verbal contact, which was unsuccessful. That's not a negotiation. But here's why it still matters. Choosing to attempt communication instead of an immediate entry reflects a mindset or a shift of mindset away from an active shooter scenario and toward an isolation and containment scenario of a barricaded suspect. So before we go any further, it's important to clear up some information that's often misreported or misunderstood, because now accuracy matters here. Pete Arredondo was not inside the classroom with the shooter at any point. There is no credible evidence, no body camera footage, and no investigative finding that places him inside the room where the shooter was located. He remained in the hallway outside the connected classrooms. That distinction matters because claims that he was inside the room are not supported by the record, and they distract from the real issue, which is command decision making. Multiple law enforcement agencies responded to the Uvalde shooting. When multiple agencies respond, officers often defer to their command leadership. That's normal. However, if one agency thinks another agency has command, and that agency thinks command is still with local leadership, you get a vacuum. And in emergencies, a vacuum gets filled by hesitation, and hesitation usually results in bad things happening. There must be interagency coordination and interoperability, meaning that all agencies operating within a jurisdiction should have coordinated response procedures already in place. Agencies should have communication abilities with each other. In the NYPD, in large scale incidents, the scene doesn't organize itself. Someone must and does take command, establish roles, and implement a professionally designed plan, which is already in place. So everyone knows what their role is before they even get there. When I was in the NYPD, as well as in private sector security, we used to run what we called tabletop exercises where we would bring together multiple local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies and essentially rehearse who would do what in a large-scale incident, coordinate the response, simulate a scenario, and formulate a logistical and operational plan. A chaotic event would result in an organized, practiced response where all agencies involved would know their role and most importantly, who was in command. Now, let's talk about what the investigation said and why it matters. After Uvalde, the response was investigated and reviewed from multiple angles. The Texas House Investigative Committee report described widespread systemic failures and poor decisions by law enforcement and emphasized the magnitude of the breakdowns to the information flow and how compromised information affected the response. On January 18th, 2024, DOJ released its critical incident review, describing a thorough assessment of the response and identifying cascading failures in law enforcement response, including coordination and communication issues. My professional takeaway on these independent investigations from different institutions converge on the same theme, which was a leadership breakdown, coordination failure, and confusion. And that's not political spin. That's operational and logistical truth. Now let's talk about which happened in 2024. And accountability is difficult in cases like this for legal and practical reasons. But in 2024, something significant happened. A grand jury returned indictments related to the law enforcement response. On June 27th, 2024, reporting confirmed that former Uvalde CSID police chief Pete Arredondo and former officer Adrian Gonzalez were indicted on felony charges connected to the response. The indictment accuses Arredondo of directing officers away from immediate engagement and instead ordering a delay in pursuit of what prosecutors describe as negotiation, which slowed the timely confrontation of the shooter. In post-incident interviews, though, Arredondo said he didn't consider himself the incident commander and that communication challenges contributed to his situational awareness. Those comments have informed part of the debate over his role in the delayed response. This differentiates his stated intent from investigators' conclusions. The investigative timeline shows that he remained in the hallway, attempted to speak through the wall to the suspect, and gave orders that delayed entry. Prosecutors allege in his indictment that these decisions, including prioritizing communication over immediate engagement, owed the response to an active shooter, and that is what was central to his charges. That's why the indictment filed in 2024 doesn't hinge on where Arredondo was standing. It focuses on what prosecutors allege he failed to do, which was to identify the incident as an active shooter, which requires direct, immediate engagement. He didn't act in accordance with training designed exactly for that scenario. Now, ultimately, the court is going to decide guilt or innocence, but operationally, the lesson is already clear. Now to the indictment of Officer Adrian Gonzalez. Prosecutors are claiming that Gonzalez was among the first officers on the scene, that he heard the gunfire, and that he was aware that children were inside the classroom. And that, despite having a duty to act, he did not engage, delay the shooter, or assist victims in reaching medical care. The indictment of Adrian Gonzalez does not allege intent, malice, or participation in the shooting. It alleges omission. Now, in legal terms, this is a claim that a duty existed, the danger was known, and there was an opportunity to intervene, and that none of these obligations were met. In other words, prosecutors are stating that there was a failure to act where duty existed. So, in practical terms, command ambiguity may explain why officers hesitated, but it does not automatically negate individual duty. Prosecutors are arguing that duty survives confusion. Whether the courts accept that argument remains to be seen, but its presence alone marks a significant shift in how accountability is being pursued after Uvalde. Now, from a command perspective, this raises a difficult question. At what point does institutional paralysis stop excusing inaction and start defining it? Is the question this indictment puts before the courts. It's important to understand how unusual this type of prosecution is. Criminal cases tied to police inaction during mass casualty events are extremely rare. One of the only comparable cases I could think of in the United States came out of the Parkland school shooting, where a school resource officer was criminally charged for failing to confront the shooter. He was later acquitted, but that's the closest thing I could come to as a comparison to the Uvalde case. The outcome, though, underscores how difficult these cases are to prosecute. The Gonzalez indictment in Uvalde is significant, not because it guarantees a result, but because it represents one of the few times prosecutors have ever attempted to impose criminal liability for inaction during an active shooter response. So what are the lessons? What changes will prevent failures like this? So if you want prevention, real prevention, here are the non-negotiables. First and foremost, immediate designation of an incident commander. First, we need to have a clear classification. Is it an active shooter? Is it a barricaded suspect? We need to have interoperable communications and disciplined information flow. We need to have command transition protocols in a multi-agency scene. Training that is evaluated under stress conditions, not classroom conditions. There's a difference. Because you can have high-powered weapons, shields, multiple officers and agencies, tactical training, and still fail if you don't have a commander. My job here isn't to convict anyone on a podcast. The courts will handle that. My job is to explain why, from an operational standpoint, Uvalde has painfully learned that when command is unclear, when there is a misclassification of a major event, the response time becomes a weapon against the victims. Before we end, folks, I'm going to name the victims, not as a formality, but because they are the reason this matters. 19 children and 2 teachers were killed at Robb Elementary. The students, Nevia Alyssa Bravo, 10 years old, Jacqueline Jalen Cazares, 9 years old, McKenna Lee Elrod, 10 years old, Jose Manuel Flores Jr., 10 years old, Eliana Amia Garcia, 9 years old, Uzziah Sergio Garcia, 10 years old, Ameri Joe Garza, 10 years old, Xavier James Lopez, 10 years old, Jace Carmelo Luvanos, 10 years old, Tess Marie Mata, 10 years old, Miranda Gail Mathis, 11 years old. Alethea Haven Ramirez, 10 years old. Annabelle Guadalupe Rodriguez, 10 years old. Maite Juliana Rodriguez, 10 years old. Alexandria Anaya Rubio, 10 years old. Layla Marie Salazar, 11 years old. Jayla Nicole Seguero, 10 years old. Eliana Cruz Torres, 10 years old. Rogelio Fernandez Torres, 10 years old. And teachers Irma Linda Garcia, 48 years old, and Ava Morales, 44 years old. We honor them not by repeating confusion and lack of definitive leadership, but by demanding competence. Because confusion and command indecision is not an acceptable cause of death. I'm Mike Blangiforti, and this is Truth, Investigations, and Criminal Behavior. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.